This is a review of the 1948 Anatole Litvak film, Sorry, Wrong Number. This movie is perhaps a follow-up, this review is perhaps a follow-up to my review of The Slender Thread, another movie about telephones, and of course it's a follow-up to my recent review of The Snake Pit, which is another Anatole Litvak film, also from 1948, a phenomenal movie that really whet my appetite for his work and his filmography. The eagle-eyed among you might notice that I'm packing up right now. In a couple of weeks, these videos will be coming to you from a different apartment, but the general service will remain the same. Please excuse any erratic programming between then and now, but I'm quite busy. For now, the movie, Sorry, Wrong Number, like I said, 1948, Anatole Litvak. It's got Barbara Stanwyck and Burt Lancaster in it. It's also got Leif Erikson, but not that Leif Erikson, just like The Snake Pit. Like I said, same year as The Snake Pit. Kind of impressive that he made two movies in the same year, but that was the studio system cranking the films out. This movie is not anywhere near as good as The Snake Pit. Go watch The Snake Pit. Great movie. Go watch my review of The Snake Pit. Great review. I don't know. Okay review. This is a genre film. The Snake Pit is sort of a transcendental movie that covers a lot of interesting territory that's broad and thorough. This movie isn't any of those things. This is a genre film. And what genre is it? Well, 1948, you've basically got two options. It's a film noir. I'm not sure if I've actually done a single video focused, like reviewed a film just in one video, that's a noir on this channel yet, which is kind of surprising. I used to be a huge noir fan when I was younger, I guess in high school. And I still enjoy. I won't bore you with some of the style things about the noir. You probably already know it's supposed to be dark and shadowy and such. But let's talk about style a little bit up front. So the question here is whether or not this has the indelible mark of Anatole Litvak, and it does. This is a classy film in terms of style. I don't like describing anything as classy exactly, but here it seems to fit. What really struck me about The Snake Pit was how fluent he was, how many different techniques there were that seemed to be employed rather seamlessly, and a lot of whip pans. This movie has kind of the same thing, where it's not an over-the-top sort of special effects heavy film or anything like that, but it's just a movie that seems very fluent, that seems to be sort of free in its movement, easily able to explore its surroundings, its territory, and to express what it needs to via style. Let me give you a couple more concrete examples if those vagaries aren't particularly satisfying. Here's one thing. This movie focuses a large part on the events happening within one room. So a little bit of plot information here. Barbara Stanwyck plays an invalid in the film who's bedridden and who can communicate with the world only via a telephone. The phone basically serves as a frame for the rest of the movie. I'll talk about this a little bit more, but the point is you spend a lot of time in her bedroom, which is in an apartment in New York. Great apartment in Murray Hill. Wow, that is a fancy place. I wish I could live someplace like that now. The apartment, there's a lot of movies that are set sort of in one room. There's also plenty of movies that have sort of similar dynamics, whether it's Wait Until Dark or The Lady in the Cage, or what I think those are both examples of sort of women who are trapped in their apartments one way or another. It's a bit of a challenge. Of course, Rear Window, legendary movie about a guy hanging out in an apartment. It can be a little bit of a challenge to make the most out of the surroundings and the scenery. This movie does a good job, and this is where you see Litvak's sort of fluency of style come into play. There's a lot of sort of panning around, a lot of interesting exploration of the room that is a little bit ahead of its time, I think, for 1948. You wouldn't see quite so much of this in your average noir film that would maybe be just a little bit more static or something like that. But they do a lot of sort of exploration of the room, making the most out of it. And it's got nice set decoration too. It's also filmed seemingly in the real apartment, so you see out the window to the Ed Koch Queensboro Bridge, although it probably wouldn't have been called the Ed Koch Bridge at the time. Maybe, I'm not actually sure it is the Queensboro. Well, okay, whatever. I think it is. I guess it was just maybe renamed. I don't know the history of the bridge. Forgive me. Anyway, it makes the most of that. There's also a nice tie-in to the plot with some of the surroundings that go on. So, like I said, they do a good job with that room. There's a couple of shots in the movie that are really significant. One of them is an incredible crane shot in this movie that kind of blew my mind when I saw it. That starts focusing in on Barbara Stanwyck in bed, and you see her it's a close-up, more or less, of her in bed, or a medium shot of her in her bed on the phone, and the camera pulls back and pulls back and pulls back and pulls back and pulls back out of the window, and then goes down outside of the building to the ground floor and follows some action there. Really cool, really impressive. People would be proud of a shot like that in a movie that came out today, let alone 1948. And of course, the other significant shot in the movie is the whip pan, which Anatole blesses us with in this film. Only one, unlike the 50 or 60 that appear in The Snake Pit. But it's there. So, like I said, this movie does seem kind of a cut above stylistically in some ways. It's pretty interesting. It seems like a nicely made movie. I take that as the mark of LITVAK. Of course, I'm now his biggest fan, and we will be very shortly reviewing more of his movies. I know, you can't wait. But what's the movie about? Well, like I said, it's sort of focuses on this invalid Barbara Stanwyck's character, but really, it's kind of more about her husband, Burt Lancaster. That's what the plot of the film is about, but the movie has kind of this interesting frame. So the primary events of the film are all kind of surrounding Burt Lancaster, his life, and what things are going on. He is the center of the plot of the movie, but we see the movie from this sort of withdrawn position. The film actually opens with sort of an interesting opening scroll that says, a long time ago in a galaxy, that says something about telephones basically permeating the world, and about how our emotions, our experiences, and our view of the modern world is facilitated through this network, this technological network of telephones. Right now, the old telephone, the hand crank telephone with the operator, well, this wasn't even touch-tone dialing yet. These are with operators and such, so you just pick up the phone and ask for Murray Hill 601 or whatever. That might seem hopelessly antiquated, but this idea of sort of this mediating network that's controlling, well, not controlling exactly, but that is, mediating, facilitating our emotions in our life and our world, and that is framing the way that we see things, well, that is, as significant as ever. And this movie is kind of interesting in the way that it addresses that. This is not some intellectual film that's really focused on that, but it's there in the background, and there's kind of interesting undercurrent that, again, seems like the mark of LITVAK, with just kind of some interesting subtext in the film. Like I said, you mainly focus on Barbara Stanwyck, and this is interesting. This is kind of good and bad. Like I said, it invokes this sort of subtext about the telephone. It's kind of interesting in that regard. It's maybe good because the plot of the film otherwise probably isn't quite enough just to carry the movie along. If we were only focusing on Burt Lancaster, it would just be sort of a very generic kind of noir sort of story, and it's more or less just enhanced due to the mechanism of how they tell the story. I am sort of on the fence about this. I'm not a huge fan of movies that have plots that the story itself isn't that interesting, and the way the story is told is what actually makes the film. Of course, like the most obvious example of this would be a movie like Memento or something, where perhaps the plot itself isn't significant, but it's all in sort of the way that the story is told. And I'm not saying that I'm not making any bold claims about that movie, but I will say I'm sometimes a little bit on the fence about this, and this movie definitely falls into this category. Not exactly a gimmick, but just one where sort of, withholding information from the audience is a big part of making the movie work, and if the audience knew everything that were going on from the beginning, it wouldn't be a very interesting movie. There are tons of movies that do not fall into this category, where the audience basically knows what's happening from the beginning. The movie doesn't have to withhold information to build suspense to keep people engaged. It just tells you what's going on, and because the story is interesting, you're engaged. Okay. One of the reasons why bringing Barbara Stanwyck into the fold is somewhat problematic in this movie is because Barbara Stanwyck's character is extremely unlikable. And this is by design, but I didn't realize this at first. And the movie confounded me for maybe the first 10 or 15 minutes because I wasn't sure how the heck I was supposed to be connecting to Barbara Stanwyck's character. And then I realized, oh, you're not supposed to connect to Barbara Stanwyck's character. She's not a good character. She's not the good guy, even though she's sort of positioned as the main character and positioned empathetically as this invalid who's bedridden and who's vulnerable, potentially being taken advantage of, unable to connect with the people she needs to, and such. You would think that they're setting you up to empathize with her, but you realize as the movie goes on that that's absolutely not the case. Burt Lancaster is the main character of the movie. You're supposed to empathize with him. So that sort of confounds things. Barbara Stanwyck's character is in some ways not so different from some of her other characters. For instance, in Double Indemnity, her character is sleazy, deliberately so, right? She wears the wig there, the blonde wig picked out, particularly to make her look as sleazy as possible, according to Billy Wilder. In a movie like The Strange Love of Martha Ivers, that's a great film noir movie. That's a really twisted noir. I think that's Barbara Stanwyck, right? She plays Martha Ivers, I believe, who's also kind of a sickly character to some degree, similar to her role in Double Indemnity, this sort of immoral, sickly woman or whatever. And this is a hallmark of noir films, right? This was a time of gendered cinema where you largely had movies that were sort of women's pictures, which were sort of tearjerkers sorts of things, usually movies about maternal sacrifice, like To Each His Own. I mentioned, I think, when I reviewed The Snake Pit, that's an Olivia de Havilland movie in which she is the sacrificing mother. Stella Dallas is sort of the canonical example, I guess, although that's from the 30s, not the 40s. Anyway, that's where you get the women that you can empathize with, and the empathy with the mother basically drives the entire plot of the movie. Film noir is not that. And so in some ways, you shouldn't really expect to empathize with Barbara Stanwyck's character, and I don't know why the heck I was for the first 10 minutes, except that she's sort of set up a little bit deceivingly as the main character because of the way the frame works. Okay, I think you get the idea. Basically, Barbara Stanwyck, bad guy. Not that uncommon for her, but a little bit interesting in this movie. Once you sort of realize that, you realize, oh, this is very much... Once you adjust and realize that the movie is basically coming from Burt Lancaster's perspective, is basically about him, and it's the story of his tragic downfall, essentially, you realize, oh, yeah, right, of course it is, because this is how all noir movies work, more or less. Noir films, like I said, I wasn't going to touch on the stylistic hallmarks, but I think it's worth mentioning sort of some of the plot hallmarks, which are sometimes maybe overlooked by the Film School 101 crowd or something like that. In a lot of times, I think film noir movies are, in some ways, the opposite of a Frank Capra movie, basically. The opposite of the feel-good story of a simple man going to the big city and making things work or something like that, right? We've got these movies like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. This simple guy comes from the country and comes into Washington and wins people over, essentially, and is able to show them the folly of their ways and spread this very sort of populist message and such. Well, in film noir movies, basically the exact opposite happens. And this movie's a great, great example of this because Burt Lancaster comes from Grassville. And I can't remember if they say what state it is. But basically he comes from the boonies out in the middle of nowhere. Is sort of idealistic to some degree. Comes to the city, marries into money, and ultimately it erodes him. His Barbara Stanwyck's immoral action sort of her Karening, essentially, her entitlement and neediness, erode him. The position he's been put into erodes his moral character, and he's basically eaten up by the city and by the modern metropolis and such, and forced, tragically, to turn, well, not really to turn, but basically forced into tragedy. Let's put it that way. So the tragic downfall of a simple man coming to the city is the noir, which is, you see this in tons of movies. Like you got Scarlet Street is another New York movie, great example of this. A humble painter is sort of forced into tragedy by the snafus and the vices of the city and such. And this movie is exactly like that. The only hitch, like I said, is that it starts out being told from Barbara Stanwyck's perspective, more or less, and you don't quite realize that. So, overall, is this a great movie? Well, not really. There are far, far better noir films out there. Like I said, this movie does have some marks of Anatol Litvak. It has some things that are kind of nice about it. And the frame is kind of interesting. It gives you a little bit of different perspective. Little bit of figuring out you have to do in the beginning to realize exactly how you're supposed to watch the movie. But overall, the plot is not super interesting. Fairly generic. There is one nice twist in it that I will not give away. But that is pretty cool, both in that it's legitimately kind of surprising, and the way that they reveal it is really nice. I will mention, too, that at the very beginning of the movie, things seem sort of predictable. to some degree. You think, oh, I know exactly how this is going to go. Well, you don't. And I got to give the movie credit for that. This, I think, is the case. May even be deliberate to some extent. Sometimes when people watch old movies, they go into it expecting it to be very predictable, and they don't give enough credit to the writers back in the 40s or something, and to the audiences back in the 40s who also knew how to predict how film might go, and who were, in fact, far more well-versed in the genres of the time, and would have been way better than a modern viewer at figuring out how film noir film was going to end. So you might sort of think in the first few minutes, oh, well, obviously X, Y, and Z are going to happen. That ain't what happens. And I actually think it's probably deliberate to some degree that it lures you in. There's some nice suspense in the beginning with the sort of dramatic irony that they're building here. But I think in this case, the writers, they're ahead of you here. Even with that said, though, this is sort of a generic plot line in some ways that is more or less engaging, but nothing super groundbreaking. The one final thing to mention here, and then I think I will have emptied my brain on this movie. The one final thing to mention is that, like I said, a lot of this movie takes place in one room, but you very quickly realize, oh, okay, they're not going to do the whole movie with just Barbara Stanwyck in her bedroom. And this is, I've mentioned this before, but some movies are interesting because when you watch them, you're curious about how they're going to function, right? Like a movie will set out some sort of standard for itself, like some movies that take place in like one room, and you think, how's this going to work out? What's this movie actually going to be like? And sometimes this can be a little bit of a gimmick, but it can be kind of fun as well. This movie starts to lean a little bit down that road when it opens with Barbara Stanwyck making a bunch of phone calls to various people from her apartment. But before too long, it jumps back into flashback and tells us a bunch of other stories. We learn a whole bunch of other stuff. And you realize, oh, okay. So this movie's not going to take place entirely in the bedroom, which is probably a good thing, because I don't think the story and the acting is quite dynamic enough to make that work. Burt Lancaster, pretty good in this movie. Barbara Stanwyck, a little bit over the top. Like I said, delivering sort of a similar role to Strange Love of Martha Ivers, and a bit worse version of Phyllis Dietrichson from Double Indemnity. So that is, sorry, wrong number, from 1948, the Anatol Litvak film. It's a, okay movie. Does have some quality things in it. If you like noir, it's worth checking out, I guess, but it's not the first noir film that I would recommend.